Our house is owned by Neil and Emma Simmons. Neil is a classical sculptor and Emma's an artist who's now devoting her energy to restoring their home. You have made Dan such a happy man.
He's at home.
He is at home, exactly. OK, so you've made his day, but how can we help you?
We want to know who lived in the house because it's such a multicultural area here, and it'd be just so interesting to know what nationalities and what, if they worked in the house or what they did.
OK, Neil, how about you?
Well, I would like to know why it's so different from all the other houses and the anomalies inside.
Dan turned his attention to Neil's question about the puzzling exterior, while Judith and I were keen to see how far they'd got with restoring the inside of the house.
You're right, Neil, the front of your house is different. Look at the house next door. That's a typical good Spitalfields 1720s facade. 3 windows per floor, beautiful red brick dressings around the windows, and the sashes are set in these boxes, these timber boxes set flush with the elevation. That's typical 1720-ish Spitalfields. Your house, of course, very different. A different colour of brick, no dressings around the windows, and I suppose most notably that your sashes are set back 4 inches. All typical details of the late 18th, early 19th century, really.
Clearly a lot of money had been spent on the house in the early 1800s, almost a century after it was built. A new frontage had been added, a grand marbled hallway, and there was more. In the middle of scraping off the old wallpaper in the downstairs front room, Emma had made the most exciting discovery of all.
And here I started stripping the paper because I had white paper everywhere, and I discovered these lines. And then I saw these flowers in the corners.
They're lovely, yeah, really lovely.
And then worked my way upwards and found them at the top as well.
This is a grand scheme. This is something you would expect to find in a stately home, not in a house in Spitalfields.
I was so lucky that it wasn't covered in paint because we wouldn't have known what was underneath.
Of course,
exactly.
A lot seems to have survived.
And this is very, very unusual to find this. It's a very, very exciting discovery.
Perhaps the strangest feature of all was at the back. Instead of a garden, there were some tacked-on outbuildings, wholly out of character with the rest of the house. So, what had happened? I took a closer look at Dan's survey of London to see how it all began. This is a map, 1681-82, and I've identified this area as being where your house now stands, and this shows 1681-82, that basically it was a field.
There's no roads.
Nothing.
They're all missing. Fournier Street.
Yeah, none of it's there. But
in
this neighbouring map of 1746, ta-da, there it is. So we know now at this time there was definitely a development here, and there is your street. And then the other thing that's also quite interesting is looking at this. We've got here in January 1719-20, the lease was assigned, the lease of your home was assigned to a Peter Bourdon, who was a weaver. And in 1724, it was occupied by a Daniel Pilon. Oh. So we have something now to go on, so we've basically got to just find out more about these characters. Mm-hmm.
Wow, I like this, the big field.
It's great, isn't it? Bourdon and Pilon were clearly French names. That would fit in with the area, which Dan knew owed much of its character to the influx of Huguenot refugees. The Huguenots were French Protestants who'd fled Catholic persecution in France in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Nicholas Peter Pilon was clearly making enough money from his silk weaving business to have made all the 19th century improvements to the house, but we didn't yet know if he was still living there at that time. While Judith and Emma continued stripping the walls, I wanted to get more of a sense of what the silk weaving business was all about, so I headed off to the Victoria and Albert Museum.
This is a classic Spitalfield dress from the earlier part of the 18th century. In this period, the designs were still quite heavy and formal, and this one shows very clearly a balanced mirror image design, lots of silver thread, chenille and silk in the pattern. It would have been very heavy. One of the things that characterises dresses of this period is the enormous weight.
So what sort of people would have bought these dresses?
Well, something like this one that has so much silver in it, and it's real silver thread, would have been worn by a very, very wealthy lady. In the 1720s, the English industry was doing pretty well on a high and getting more and more successful. and increasing in its trade and particularly its markets overseas. There was a huge market with the New World, the American colonies, and very large numbers of English silks were going out to America.
We're particularly interested in a weaver called Monsieur Pilon, who was living in our house around the 1720s in Princlet Street. Do you know much about Princlet Street?
Princlet Street was home to a number of important people in the Spitalfields silk industry, and I think for him to have lived there then suggests that he was by that stage already a master weaver, that he would have served an apprenticeship as a weaver, but would have gone on to bigger and better things.
So there would be no weaving in our house?
I think it's very unlikely.
Right.
It would have been where he lived.
Where might have some of Monsieur Pilon's designs come from?
Well, he would have used the services of freelance silk designers, of which there were a number in Spitalfields, and we actually know that one of them, one of the most important, a woman called Anna Maria Garthwaite, lived in Princlet Street, so she would have been one of his near neighbours.
At that time?
Well, she lived there from the late 1720s through to the 1750s.
Oh, so it would have been.
One of the wonderful things about Garthwaite's designs is she was a very good watercolour painter, and the botanical details she gets into his designs are very beautiful.
So you say botanical. Might have that inspiration come from the market?
I think certainly she would have gone to the market, seen the new flowers. She was very interested in new types of flowers that were coming in from the New World, and so she incorporated some flowers in her designs that had never been seen in England before.
The naturalistic flowers were very similar to the flowers in the house. These too may have been inspired by the market. But who had them painted? Helen Hughes of English Heritage arrived to photograph them and take some samples for analysis. We hoped this would give us a date and tell us whether they could have been done during Pilon's time. The house had gone in just one generation from smart townhouse to factory. The occupants had had to convert it to an industrial use in order to survive the lean years. But who had done it?
It's the most wonderful map, 1873 Ordnance Survey. This answers one of those basic questions. The date of the back extension of the warehouse is not there in 1873, you see.
No.
So there's some extension, but not the big factory. Now, if we go to the next Ordnance Survey map, this is 1894 revision, and there's your house, and one can see that the building that you have now are all built. So Emma, your back extensions are not there in 1873, they are there in 1894. So therefore we can assume they were probably built during the 1880s.
And that's what we've got now.
That's what's there now. If we now look at the census of 1881, this should really tell us the people living in the house, when the back extension was built. We look down here, we can see there were 12 people living in your house.
Well,
so, multi-occupied, because they are probably...
More than one family.
Exactly, certainly two, maybe three, probably certainly two families. And if we look here, Richard Wynne, head of the largest family, he was aged 54, and he was a salesman, probably a salesman in the fruit and veg market across the road. So, one assumes that Neil's right. The warehouse at the back was for storing fruit, probably for ripening bananas. So if you now go to the next census, 1891, we can see how your house is faring. And here we see, look, there it is, Princlet Street. And here we have Jacob Hyams, head of his family, tailor, so in the rag trade. And it even says where born, and he comes from Russia. If we look at this map, Jewish East London, around about 1900, and if you look, yes, at our little bit, Spitalfields, it's quite extraordinary. It's an island, really, of blue. If we look for our street, Princlet Street, there, you see, I think it's the second tone, isn't it? That's 75 to 95% Jewish.
We were getting a very full picture of the life of our house, and thanks to Garth's work, the front room was on the way to regaining its former glory.
What do you reckon? Look, the colour's completely different.
We've actually had the results back from the paint analysis we did, and it was actually a mix of Prussian blue and yellow ochre, which was a really vibrant green. But that was a very fugitive pigment. That meant it dulled down actually very quickly. So it went down to this very pale green. The other thing that's come up from the paint analysis is that Helen Hughes from English Heritage found 3 schemes. This was actually the 3rd scheme in the room, which puts this decoration slightly later than we thought, because we were talking about this room being sort of 1800s. So with these 3 periods of decoration, I would say that this scheme was applied somewhere between 1810 to 1820.
So what would you like to do with it now?
Well, I love the way it's, all those big holes have been filled in and the colour is all changing, and I think it's so important not to lose the oldness of it and not to make it looking too new.
So keep it much as it is?
Keep it much as it is.
Pretty much so, yeah, I think so. I just love the subtlety of the colour. It's just so
it is very calming, isn't it? So how do you feel about your home now that you've learned what you have?
Yeah, I mean, the wonderful thing is to know, I mean, I always thought our house was slightly different to the other ones because of the Regency rooms downstairs, and now I know why.
It all makes sense.
I know, it does, yeah.